Hello and welcome to Ways to Change the World. I'm Krishnan guru-murthy, and this is the podcast in which we talk to extraordinary people about the big events in their lives and the events that have helped shape them. My guest this week is Ayesha Vardag. She's, well, sort of a celebrity divorce lawyer. She's famous for representing the rich and the powerful in big, high-worth divorce cases, and she's been a legal pioneer. One of her cases changed the law quite fundamentally with regard to the recognition of prenuptial agreements, and we'll talk about that in a little while. Ayesha, your world is a controversial one for many people. I mean, is divorce making people's lives better and freeing them, or is it a bad thing? And where are lawyers in all of that? Are lawyers the conduits for happiness, or are they parasites? Are sort of the things people I think often talk about. So how do you feel you sit when it comes to making the world a better place as a divorce lawyer?
I think whether lawyers make the world a better place or not in the field of divorce really depends on the lawyers. There are unscrupulous lawyers who will try to milk a situation basically for fees. So they'll push division, perhaps they'll work things out. They'll then try to make things more acrimonious so that they can keep things running and take out more and more fees. These people are the worst of the worst and really have no place in family law. However, I think if you're a responsible family lawyer, then yes, you are part of the solution. If you have a couple, if you have a person that comes to you, you have a duty to explore whether it's something that could reconcile, and to refer them to therapists or whatever might help them in order to take that forward. And I've managed that a few times, and it's always tremendously satisfying when you feel that you've brought people back together. The other thing it does, though, is it does, as you say, free people from situations that have become one way or another intolerable. And this can be because they're experiencing something terrible like domestic violence. They may be in fear of their lives. They may have somebody who's just being nasty to them, or the relationship may just have degenerated so that through no fault of anyone, they've grown apart and they just don't want to be together again. I think we need to get rid of the rather Victorian idea that marriage has to be for life. We've accepted divorce is part of our world, and we've accepted that relationships end. So I think that we need to take an approach that will accept that the right way to behave when things do come to an end is just to part amicably, to part gently, and with no retribution on any side. I was very strong on pushing for no-fault divorce, which has, thank goodness, now passed into being a bill, and we just need to get into Parliament. Then we've at least got that. So we removed the situation where people have to sling mud at each other to get out of a relationship, and there has to be someone who's at fault because this is a bad thing. Divorce isn't necessarily a bad thing. In the old days, people used to murder their husbands and wives when they found their relationships intolerable. That doesn't happen very often anymore because there's the way out of divorce, and it means that people are free to end one chapter of their lives and then to move on to another chapter of their lives. Lawyers' jobs are to try to facilitate all of that and to give the person that they're representing a good platform to go forward with that next phase of their lives, in which they have proper relationships going on with their children, a proper financial base, and a secure platform for a new beginning.
And so do you think that the conflict still needs to be taken out of divorce? Will we ideally move to a place where we don't need litigation and we don't need lawyers? I mean, is that possible?
I'm not 100% sure it's possible without fundamentally changing the way that human beings behave towards each other, but on a much deeper and broader level than divorce. But it's certainly the case that we can reduce a lot of the conflict. I've seen through the sort of 20 or so years that I've been doing this, such different approaches to litigation. And some of the lawyers who really are involved in a lot of major cases and therefore have a lot of influence can take an incredibly aggressive approach that can be very nasty, both to the lawyers on the other side and to the clients on the other side. And I think that there is absolutely no place for that. Judges also need to remember that they're not dealing with two criminals, that they're dealing with two people that they should be respectful and kindly to. And the whole profession needs to up its game on that front.
I mean, you came to this, to being a divorce lawyer, and partly through your own experience of divorce, and started off working for your own divorce lawyer. You know, I mean, what did you learn along the way? I mean, how messy was this in your case?
Fortunately, it was a situation that we were able to resolve, so we were able to settle it. But it was certainly extremely traumatic, especially for us, because we were quite young. We had kind of got rather quickly into divorce, partly because of people on all sides pushing us and saying, no, this is what you have to do. You don't do this, you'll be pathetic and stupid. Life's too short, all of this stuff to both of us. Whereas actually we did love each other very much. And I feel quite strongly, it's part of the thing that motivates me to try to reconcile couples if I can, is that actually we could probably have worked it out with a bit more time and a bit more support from other people. And that would have been great. Now we're very good friends that care very much about each other. But it's a shame that we lost each other and that we didn't have the opportunity to try harder.
But this isn't the law that you originally wanted to do, is it? I mean, what was your ambition?
Initially, I wanted to be a barrister. And then after I discovered that would leave me very domestically based, I moved into wanting to be a solicitor so that I could practice international law. I was very interested in public international law, and I wanted to be in an international firm. So I went to an international city firm. I trained in London and in Moscow. And then through a series of events, I found myself back to the bar because I found myself in England properly. So I was training as a barrister, and that was when my divorce hit. And it was very unexpected because having worked a lot on my own divorce, because I was trying to save costs, because I was interested. So I was drafting affidavits, I was drafting bits of letters. After it was all over, I went out to dinner with my divorce lawyer sometime after, and he said, "Oh, I'm very busy. Look, why don't you come and work for me?" And I found it was just so much more interesting as a field, because the thing about family law is you're not only dealing with interesting intellectual concepts the way that you are in commercial law, it's intellectually interesting, but more than that, after you've sort of juggled and made your way through dividing up marriages that can be like demerging global corporations, or you've pushed the frontiers of the law, when you come back to it underneath, it's a couple, it's human beings whose lives you're fundamentally able to change. It's not a bunch of bankers where any change that happens is a long way down the line and very distant. It's people you can see changing their homes, moving, changing their relationships with their children, getting free of oppressive relationships. What you become is the mouthpiece for somebody's life, for somebody's story. So they come to you, they tell you what's happened, and you have to translate it into something that's relevant for the law and that is persuasive and tells their story in a compelling way. And that's also fantastically satisfying to be able to be someone's voice and be someone's advocate.
That's quite a good analogy, isn't it? Because you're not the advocate, you're not the barrister when it comes to court, are you? But you are effectively writing the story, writing the script.
Yeah, that's right. Yes, you have to. You're the one who's directly listening to the client and translates all of the input that you have into something that is really the baseline of the story that everybody will work on.
Now, you represent mostly wealthy clients, and I'll come to that in a moment, but one of the things that is striking about it is how many of them want to bring their divorce case in the English court system. Why is that? I mean, is the English court system especially equitable? Yeah. Which would be quite surprising.
Yes, the simple answer is yes. It's very redistributive, you could say, and it is premised on very, very solid principles, which are that marriage is a partnership. You go into it together and you build things up together. And one of you might be taking the role of breadwinner, the other might be taking the role of homemaker, but you are a partnership taking different roles within a team. And so the fruits of that marriage should broadly be divided equally, except in quite exceptional circumstances. And that's a very attractive position. It's very fair. It's sort of non-chauvinist because it's recognizing the value of different roles and how people want to arrange their lives. the value also of having the ability to have prenuptial agreements is that people can choose together by consent to arrange their lives differently. But the default is, if you don't agree something different, the fruits of your marriage will be divided equally. And more than that, the English courts are very good at really digging into that. There are other jurisdictions that will say they do that, but they won't really go much beyond what the richer party is saying. And so, it's all very well to know you're getting half, but it's half of what? If the other person says, I lost all my money in the recession lately, or, no, it's all gone, or I've given it all to my brother, or whatever, you have to be able to go behind that. And the English courts are very, very good at that.
So what sort of lengths do people go to hide their money? I mean, obviously without identifying anyone.
The classic ones are very complex, offshore trust structures, using all sorts of trust devices, sometimes involving charities, making things very opaque in that way, giving things away to relatives, friends, this kind of thing, and saying that it's nothing to do with the marriage, it's just, this happened. What happens is the techniques that are adopted for tax planning, or sometimes for tax avoidance, are then swung into use to protect people against their claiming spouse. And but so they've already got quite prepared to battle off the tax man.
So do you think divorce or contested divorce brings out the worst in people?
I think it can do. It's very easy for it to do that. And it's very easy for lawyers to succumb to the temptation to stoke the fire so they keep their client on side with them. I don't think it has to. And I've certainly seen clients sometimes come in to me and say, look, we built everything up together. I want you to give her, the instances actually I'm thinking of, it tends to be more commonly men who've made a lot of money. And then they say, look, I built it all up. Give half of it to her. It's fine. She deserves it. We've been together a long time. She was there all the way with me. Give her half of it or give her more. The fact is, I'll be able to build it all up again. Those are people with immense generosity of spirit, but also pretty firm degree of common sense, because the toll that a long and contested divorce can take on your own capacity to operate your business, on your reputation, all of that can be very heavy. So there is generosity, there is kindness in the law, but it's not the majority once it gets to being contested.
Now, one of your key cases was about the recognition of prenup agreements in England. So just explain, what did that case establish? Because it's not the case that a prenup is always just straightforwardly respected now, is it?
No. Prior to that case, prenups were first of all void as being contrary to public policy. That was the technical position. They were void. You were allowed to have a look at them and be aware of them when taking everything into account, be aware of the fact that the couples made an agreement. But it was just one of the factors, and it wasn't even a whole factor. It was just something you could look at. And that meant they carried very, very little weight. And what we did in that case, first of all, we overturned the principle that prenups were void as contrary to public policy. We said it's an outdated public policy that comes from a time that divorce was contrary to public policy. And so the two things went together. Now that divorce is okay, prenups have to be okay as well. But we pushed much more than that and said, look, this should be basically the default. If there's a prenup, you should default to the prenup. And it's okay to use the safeguards that we already have in the law that mean you can't, be pushed into it. You can't have duress. You can't have fraud about, the assets or whatever. You can't bully somebody into it. You can't lie. You have to have a prenup that is fairly entered into. And if you meet those standards, okay, you're halfway there. The other half is that it has to be fair as to its effect. The law is still very protective, very paternalistic, which may or may not be a good thing, but of the financially weaker party. And so they will not enforce an agreement in full if it's going to leave one party destitute. So they'll adjust a prenup to make sure that objective is attained. The upshot of all of this is prenups are valid and binding unless they're unfair. But the big thing it does is it enables people who basically stopped getting married. The super rich have largely, were generally being advised, do not marry, because it's going to be a disaster. And so because the social taboo against cohabiting and even largely against having children outside marriage has broadly gone, except where there are sort of religious considerations heavily at play. People were just choosing not to marry. And that then leaves the financially weaker party truly destitute potentially.
So what do you think of English law in terms of sexism? Is it institutionally sexist? Is it fundamentally paternalistic? Or are those days gone? Or perhaps they never existed?
I mean, I never really know what to do with the phrase or the word institutionally. There are certainly plenty of people in the law that are not remotely sexist, and now there are a lot more women in high up judicial positions as well, although fewer than there should be. But there are also plenty of male judges that aren't sexist, certainly not in terms of doing women down, but also many not in terms of sort of boosting women up because they need to look after them because we're such, poor creatures. A lot of that has gone, but there are still plenty of individuals who are like that. And the law is a collection of individuals. The judiciary is insufficiently financed, frankly, for the extraordinary brains that you need to have in the judiciary. They don't get paid enough, so you can't recruit judges very easily anymore. It used to be all the top practitioners from the bar would move up to going into the judiciary. That doesn't always happen now. Not all of them want to do it because it's the most giant pay cut. You have to work like a beast under somebody else's control, and they don't want to do it. So we need to pay the judiciary more to get more people into it. Because as it stands, we have broadly quite an elderly judiciary, which doesn't equate to prejudice, but it does mean that there are people who've grown up in different times. So there's a lot of adaptation that has to be made to get up to speed with current mores. And some people are better at doing that than others.
So you've no desire to be a judge yourself because they couldn't pay you enough?
No.
It does bring us to the question of why do you only represent rich people?
We provide an extremely high-end service that means we recruit the best people who have a lot of competition than other firms, city firms and the like, who want to recruit them. So we have to pay commensurately in order to keep that whole show on the road and to be able to provide that sort of premium service. We have high fees, very high fees relatively, because we're selling the very best, we assert, and those who come to us come for that. You can't do that at bargain basement prices because you can't pay to have the very best staff. You have to do the cases that merit a high level of expenditure. Paying our fees for a couple that doesn't have a huge amount of money would cripple them, and it wouldn't be worth it. In fact, when people come in and they ring us up and they ask us to represent them and we're not going to be appropriate, we don't take them on and milk them for as much as they've got. We say, no, let me help you, let me transfer you to another lawyer that can help you that's going to be in a cheaper firm. So we have the people who want to pay for the very best and who are in a position to afford it. Now, that doesn't mean that the actual clients have money. We represent people that don't have money, and we go through to enormous lengths like deferring fees and arranging credit and all that sort of thing for them to enable them to have the best legal representation. But there has to be money in the case that it's actually worth them doing that. Otherwise, it's a waste to have someone, so expensive.
Do you think it's a terrible thing that people without money don't have equal access to the law?
Yes, just as I think it's a terrible thing that people who don't have money are not able to have the same level of provision in so many things, in medical treatment, in education, in housing, in so many things. And the inequalities of the world are something that, that I think trouble us all. It troubles me most when you have somebody who just doesn't have any access to the law at all. Because if somebody can at least get in front of a judge, the judges are, while it's important to have a very good lawyer, at least if they're in front of the judge can try to help them and see what's going on themselves. But I think the fact that legal aid has been so very heavily cut has been disastrous for, for people at the lower end of the spectrum because that assistance isn't there.
So what would be your advice to the typical couple who don't earn a lot of money, who might be earning £35,000 to £50,000 in a year, don't have a lot of assets, probably have got a home with a mortgage? How should ordinary people approach divorce?
What I think would be the smart thing to do is to sit down with a sort of relatively easy handbook on what the law is, how it's likely to be worked out between you, work out broadly how you think the law might apply to your situation. So you've got the principles and you can say, right, so what's been built up during the marriage, we'd divide that equally. Right, these are the principles. Let's sit down together at the kitchen table and try and work this out. And let's try and stay away from the courts as much as we can.
But if you can't, if you can't take that sort of mature approach in which you sit down together and say, let's work this out, what do you do?
I mean, there are lawyers. There are lawyers that are a lot cheaper and who can be good. Just because you're working at the cheaper end of the market doesn't mean you're a bad lawyer. It just means that you've chosen to do that sort of case. And so there are perfectly good lawyers who are working with smaller cases. It's possible to get a lawyer. But the other thing that's really worth doing nowadays, if you have the courage, and it takes a bit of nerve to do it, but you get a lot of support doing it, is going to court, representing yourself in person, taking a really straightforward approach to it, not with lots of kind of recrimination and complaining, but just that this is where we are on the assets, this is where we are on the children, this is what I'd like to have, what I think is fair. Please help me. And in fact, you can both do that or even agree to do that. And then the judge will sort it out. You lean on the public system in that way.
You would advise that, would you? I mean, because what if one person has a lawyer? Would you say, if the other side's got a lawyer, definitely get a lawyer? Or would you still say, no, you could represent yourself and do well?
You can represent yourself and do well. You have to keep a cool head and focus on what's important, but you certainly can represent yourself and do well. And frankly, better to represent yourself than have a bad lawyer.
And do you think the law needs changing to make it easier for people who don't have the kind of assets that mean that they can hire wealthy lawyers?
Well, yes. And this would be a big step forward. If we could have a simpler set of rules, because as I've said to you, they could go and read a book and try to establish the principles, but they're just not set out clearly enough. And there's too much divergence between different judges and different approaches. So what we need, first of all, is properly to reform the law so that it's much more codified, so that the principles that are applied are going to be applied uniformly, and set that out really clearly. The judges always say, because they really want people to do well and be happy and have a good solution, a tailored solution for them. So they keep hanging on to their discretion so that it can be a bespoke solution for every couple. But of course, the downside of that is that every couple needs to go to court so they can have someone give them that bespoke solution. Whereas if it's really clear, then they can apply that themselves, or else it can get sorted out at a much earlier stage. So yes, making the law much simpler, straightforward principles set out so that everybody can understand these are the bits that are for sure, these are the bits that are a bit grey, and these are the kind of factors that might work, but this is how to have your basically do-it-yourself divorce kit. And even if you come to court, it's going to be much simpler. Yes, that would be a huge step forward.
What about the idea of sort of off-the-shelf prenuptial agreements for ordinary people? Would that work?
Yes, potentially, just as you have off-the-shelf wills. Just like off-the-shelf wills, there are pitfalls, there are things that can go wrong. Anything that makes this simpler will be much better. It's absolutely dreadful going through a divorce. I've been through it. Going through any litigation is bad enough and stressful enough. But when you're going through something that's also potentially heartbreaking and you're worried about your personal future, whether you'll ever find love again, whether you'll be with your children, whether your children are going to be damaged, it's absolutely dreadful. If we can at least take the acrimony out of the financial elements and the complication out of it, that would be a huge step forward.
What about you personally? I mean, how do you think you're treated? How do you think you're seen within the law, by colleagues? I mean, you've got a really interesting sort of public persona, partly because you do media and, have sort of been featured in a lot of high-profile cases that have been splashed across the newspapers. How do you feel about your own profile? Is it something you've cultivated, or is it something that's just happened?
Inevitably, I've just gone out there and tried to be myself and talk about the things that I know about and that I want to say. I have never been terribly interested in the whole sort of, I don't know, the politicking and the whole, does everybody like me thing, because I think you can never please everybody. And if you spend your time trying to do that, then you don't actually manage to achieve anything. I really care about the results I get for my clients, and I care about my community within the firm. So I care about the firm, I care about the people in it, and I want them all to like me and respect me, and I want my clients to trust me and like me and feel that I've made their lives better. Beyond that, I'm sort of not that bothered really. So I just don't know exactly how I'm seen. I think there are lots of people who like me and lots of people who don't like me, and I haven't been closely following it.
I mean, does it work for you commercially to be portrayed as the sort of the hard-nosed, brash lawyer, because that's what people want when they want someone representing them?
I mean, I don't try to portray myself as that. I don't try to portray myself as hard-nosed, or certainly not as brash. But if that's how people see me, well, something is working, because the firm has grown and grown since I started in 2005 to be, the biggest family law team by far, to be doing, a huge number of the leading cases. Whatever I'm doing, in some way, it's okay by people, or it's okay by the people that want what I have to give, or there are enough of them. So yeah, I can. It's kind of working.
What have you discovered about the way people behave during the course of being a divorce lawyer? I mean, has it been shocking?
I am surprised how adversarial things fundamentally are between people in that situation. I think it's because there is so much at stake for people. They see their whole lifestyle, their life's work, their home, their children all being potentially taken away from them. And so they're terrified. And so I suppose what comes out of it is that when people are afraid, they become very aggressive, very angry and very aggressive. Also, when people are hurt, there's always someone who's hurt, often both of them, during that process. So when people are wounded and afraid, they can become very nasty, very aggressive, and very intransigent, very fixed on the principle of little things. One of the things you have to face as a divorce lawyer is you have to be there basically 24/7 for your client. There's no sort of ever standing down, because dramatic things can happen to them at all times. I've been parked up in a Scottish lay-by when I was driving through the night to go on holiday in Scotland. And at 2:30 in the morning, my client was calling me, and the police were in her house, and her husband had breached his undertaking. We had an undertaking to sort of divide up the house so that they could both live peacefully there. He breached his undertaking, come into her area. She was scared. She called the police. So then I was talking to the police. I was dealing with her. We did all that. We got everything sorted out. And then I, got back in the road in the middle of the night. Another time I was actually sitting in the dentist's chair, having my my root canal. My root canal had got horribly infected. The whole tooth had to be removed, and it was impacted. It couldn't get out. But at the same time, my assistant had called me and said, look, our client's on the phone. He's over at the house removing his property, and he's gone a bit berserk, and he's like trying to dig up the garden sprinkler system, and it's all going crazy. Can you talk to him? So then the dentist would do a bit of like drilling and pushing and tugging. And then when there was a bit of a respite, I'd get on the phone to my client, a bit kind of finding it a bit difficult to talk because of all the anesthetic, but talking him down from the ledge and getting him to calm down. And that's incredibly important. And petty things become enormous, but it's basically because they're afraid and they're wounded. It doesn't mean that they're bad people, actually. It really doesn't. It means that they are absolutely terrified.
But you must also have learned an awful lot about how people behave in marriage, before you get to the divorce point, the infidelities, the lies, the secrets. What have you discovered about that?
It's interesting to observe that so often it's people who seem to have the most perfect lives, absolutely chocolate box, beautiful life, beautiful people with beautiful lives that everyone would dream of having. And often you find there is immense suffering concealed beneath that. Sometimes it's emotional abuse, sometimes appalling physical abuse is happening behind the perfect veneers of these lives, hidden secrets that go to the core of relationships, parallel families going on, and double lives. And it is extraordinary to me to realize how much, it never ceases to amaze me actually, how much lies beneath the surface and how wrong we can be about what people's lives are actually like.
So we talked quite a lot about sort of change and sort of what might change within the system. If you could just change the system and wave a magic wand, what would you do?
First of all, I'd simplify everything. Simplify, codify, make it obvious that anyone can pick up a little manual and they can see, right, these are the rules that are going to be applied to dividing up our marriage, getting our divorce through, sorting out things with the children. I'd simplify that. Then I would actually make it compulsory that all couples have counselling before marriage and counselling before divorce. That if you actually want to enter into the institution of marriage, you have that support to get you to explore what you want. The counselling beforehand should explore what your expectations are in relation to fidelity, in relation to money, in relation to children, and who will work and who will not, if you're going to divide responsibilities, in relation to travel, taking people away, and who's going to give when sacrifices have to be made, that explore all of those things with somebody who's qualified to help people reach some sort of resolution on that. And if they can't resolve these things, to consider whether or not to marry, maybe to live together, or maybe to part ways. So there's so much in marriage that's just about mad love, and sometimes very early, and sometimes it's driven by sex, and sometimes it's driven by just sort of passionate infatuation. Sometimes it is real love, but love that won't overcome the obstacles in perspective that are going to crop up. So ironing out, having counselling pre-marriage to iron out those differences of perspective would be very valuable. And then if it comes that you're going to divorce, rather than just the requirement to sort of look at a bit of mediation about your finances, actually to go through some counselling, either together or potentially separately if there are major problems, to support people in finding what they really want, what's really driving the separation. Is it really the end of the road, or is this something that they're rushing into, and can they be helped into a situation of a program of trying to reconcile? And can you agree things that will happen to maintain the position, to give them space to do that? I think that would be very valuable. Those are probably the two things that I think would make the biggest difference.
Ayesha Vardag, thank you very much indeed for joining us today and for sharing some of your ways to change the world. I hope you enjoyed listening to that. If you did, then please do give us a rating or a review so other people can find this podcast. Our producer is Rachel Evans. Until next time, bye-bye.